Hello. If you're like me and my clients, you probably feel like you've tried everything. And while we have tried everything under the sun, most of the plans and food approaches that we've tried assume that food is more powerful than we are. Spoiler alert, we are already powerful. However, our story has taken some of our power away, specifically in areas of our life where we aren't 100% confident in. However, we can reclaim all our power. In today's video, I'm going to share with you some healthy rebels who bravely chose to diagnose and look at their story and then courageously chose to own it, to liberate themselves for their own truce with food. Thank you so much for being here, Krista. How did it feel to identify your story in Truce with Food and recognize that that was the reason that you were falling off track, and not because you didn't have enough willpower or discipline?
So I felt like when I actually got into figuring out what my story was, it was a little bit relieving but also challenging. So I felt that prior to sort of figuring out my story, I was sort of just beating myself up constantly about like, why can't I figure this out? Why, like every day was sort of like this new beginning, and then every night was sort of this failure. And so that was really challenging, obviously, to like live day in and day out with that. But then sort of talking about your story and sort of seeing how you're sort of doing that all the time, and how it's sort of your norm is sort of this groove that you live your life in, and sort of figuring out how to really like see yourself doing these things, that also like was like, oh, that is sort of relieving, that like maybe this isn't just me being sort of a failure and not having discipline, and it's hopeful, but then it's kind of hard too, because it's like like, oh, the way I interact with my family or the way I interact with my boss or all this is all, that's maybe not, that's also challenging to sort of see yourself doing that and kind of come to grips with that, and kind of see how you could change it. So I would say that it was bittersweet, but mostly sweet. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why one of the most favorite quotes for Truce with Food people, is "the truth will set you free, but first it's going to piss you off."
Right. It's just like, so it can at times feel like you see it in one relationship, and then you're like, oh, I see that in another relationship that I'm doing this, or so it's just sort of like, oh my gosh, like, oh, this is, but it's good, because as soon as you start seeing that, you can sort of, you start to take more, I guess, more ownership, or you start to feel like, okay, like this, I can change this. And so it's more hopeful too. So
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. So what has changed in your life as a result from your food? Let's start with your food and your health. What has changed as a result of owning your story and doing that bittersweet, challenging work that
yeah.
eventually turns to more sweet?
Yeah, it does. So I guess a little bit about my story is that when I started Truce with Food, I had been sort of tried almost everything, but I was sort of one of those non-committers. Like I would do a lot of research. I would kind of know a ton of things, and I would be like, okay, I'm starting this, and I would set goals, and then 2 days a day into it, I'd find myself, going back to the foods that I was binging on, and, just sort of feeling insane around food, and sort of keeping it a secret. And, it's sort of my, just my like dirty secret that I was always doing this. Not many people knew that about me. And I was really, feeling, it had been since I was in high school that I'd been kind of acting that way around food. And so I was it had been like 15 years. I was maybe 29, 30, or maybe 29 when I started Truce with Food. And it kind of just changed. It was very subtle. It wasn't like this, like, oh my gosh, like now I'm so different or anything like that. But it was this sort of subtle change. And I think that's really what I needed, because I got so sick of this sort of promise because I've never really trusted the promise really. It was just like a nice thing to think about, like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to start over and everything's going to be different. I'm just going to, be this totally different person, even though so many things in my past sort of had led me to not think that really. So Truce With Food is sort of this subtle, like, starting to really look at my life and all the aspects more than just food. So really what's changed with food is I'm not as crazy about it. I'm not crazy around it. I don't, rush home to just sort of, I sort of use food as sort of a release. Like I'd be, starve myself most of the day, get home at night and just sort of in my own, house, just, eat as much as I possibly could until I felt really sick. And so that definitely is not happening any longer. I try to just more take care of myself. And I used to think, well, that's such BS when people would say, oh, I'm just here to take care of I'm just self-care, taking care of myself. But I really, it's just sort of a different feeling of like, now I'm trying to, maybe forecast a little bit. Like if I eat that's, if I eat that chocolate at lunch, that's fine. But I might feel a little bit tired or let's see if I do feel tired at 3:00, if I do that. So that's with the food. I've definitely just sort of, it's just a subtle difference. I'm not having just these out of control swings of food. So that's great.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the settle point because I think it's so important for people to realize when we're trying to get out of all or nothing thinking, if we get all or nothing results, that doesn't break the pattern. We have to see that slow and steady can, win the race so that when we do have chocolate at 3:00 because we want it or because we're tired, it doesn't make us blow the day because
Right.
we think we have to be perfect. It's like, okay, big deal. I will, not a big deal. So I'm glad that you pointed out that it is subtle and slow and steady. But there's a deep self-trust, I think, that sets in and that you can build when you know that you can do this slow and steady instead of have to do something very dramatic and perfect. So,
Right.
And what about what's changed in your health, if you care to share?
Yeah, I would say that I am. I mean, I didn't feel very unhealthy. I sort of just thought like the only health problem I really have is like maybe I'm carrying around like 20 extra pounds or, but through kind of Truce With Food, it sort of did, maybe not, it sort of opened me up to the possibility of, maybe my hormones are out of whack, that sort of thing. So about in February, I stopped taking birth control and I've seen a lot of changes in my body since then. And I'm feeling a lot more comfortable in my body and sort of listening to it, or, sort of being more experimental instead of sort of just ignoring. I think I was just avoiding sort of thinking, maybe not even avoiding on purpose, but sort of just knowing, or just sort of accepting things. Like I accepted that I never had a period. I accepted that my hair was thin or that I had acne. So those are the things I just sort of was like, oh, that's just my lot in life. And so now I'm sort of exploring, like maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And maybe, I can sort of start to experiment and feeling better and things like that. So yeah, that's been great.
Because you got your period.
Right, I did, yeah. So that changed. So I hadn't had a period almost my whole life. And so I started getting my period on a regular basis and, sort of learning like what my body feels like going through a cycle. I'm still in that learning process. I'm still, figuring things out. But having not had a period for like my whole life, I had some sort of weird feelings about that, obviously, like that maybe I'm just different and, like, what's this going to mean if I want to have children and things like that. So yeah, that's been really a huge positive. So.
And your hair growing more than
Yeah. So something I did notice once, a month or so after I took my IUD out, I got like a little like growth of hair like just right around the bottom, and it's like all the way down to here now, so it's growing pretty fast. And before, like I always just had thin hair. I was like, my hair grows very slow, it takes me forever, but this hair is growing super fast. So that was a huge, just like, oh, I like, maybe that, I couldn't believe it, like my, like that's what's been causing all of this. So yeah.
And your skin looks great. So you too.
Yeah, and my skin is, super clear. It's great. So I'm very, very happy about that. So
yeah. And I think just for everyone listening, the parallel is when you're in your story, it doesn't just affect food, but it creates this kind of passivity about your health. And when you own it, you start to realize that you have choices you didn't know you had, because you really are looking at yourself and how you manage things, and you get new information. And I just think you're such a great example of like taking ownership of your health and experimenting, right? We didn't know what was going to happen when you did that. And yet especially now that you're eating better, you can support your cycles and you feel that you have agency in your choices. So how has that trickled into the rest of your life? Like what else has changed?
Right. So one huge thing that did happen was I switched jobs. I was in a great job before. But I think for what I do, I was given a lot of responsibility with little sort of I didn't really want that responsibility. And I sort of, so many things just got thrown onto my plate that really weren't why. I mean, I have a graduate degree, and I was working at a lovely nonprofit, and, I had a boss that sort of just, I felt like put things on me that I just didn't necessarily want to do. But I was like, oh, well, this is for the greater good. And I love my job, and, like I can do it, and I have some experience in this, and who else is going to do it? And, like just took on a lot of just like the success of this place. Really, like I felt like I took it on personally. So like if things weren't great, I felt really shitty about it. I felt really bad about it. I took it to heart. When in reality, so many things weren't in my control. So yeah, that it was just sort of in this place of being uncomfortable often with what was being asked of me. And so in the meantime, sort of after finishing Truce with Food, I got an opportunity, and I kind of jumped at it, and it was really tricky because it wasn't just like a clean cut. My boss had previously been at the place that I was going. And so it was a challenge to sort of make that transition. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm quitting and I'll see you later, or like, I won't ever see you later, or see you again. I will see that my boss in the future. It's a small community. So that was a big, like, don't think that I would have, I think I would have been a bit scared to sort of do that. Maybe I would have done it, but I don't know. I really think that I would have been really scared to sort of make that leap. And I had support from my husband, and he was just like, you have to do this. And it's amazing job. I love it. I'm super happy I made the switch. I make more money. I have less stress. Like it was just like a no-brainer. And I'm doing, more and more things that I love. So, and I'm learning a ton, and it's just a great move. So yeah.
I'm so glad that you shared that, because when we own our story, to your point, it's hard at first, yet it develops resilience. And in Truce With Food, we learn on how to be strategic and discerning about what choices we really want versus what we think we have to do and should do. And I think, you're almost 2 years out of Truce With Food now, like a year and a half. And so I think that's the return on your investment in terms of owning your story, is that you just keep making better and better choices. Because I think one of the things that a lot of us talk about when we start to own our story is we didn't realize we were making certain choices before, right? Like, oh my God, it takes like 6 months, the first 6 months of Truce With Food, to dig yourself out of these choices that your story had you making that you didn't even know you were making.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seemed so out of my control, but like really it was me. Like, I mean, like it was me making those choices. I was allowing it to sort of happen. But I also, before, I kind of didn't see that. I sort of was just like, this is just what has to happen. Like, I don't really see any alternative, and I'm here. And so like, why not just walk all over me? Or, like there's, like I just took on stuff that wasn't really mine to take on. And I think that owning my story and seeing where I really had where my responsibility really was, is sort of what Truce with Food helped me with, is like, what is my, like, it helps me open up to like, think about that. What's my responsibility? Well, my responsibility is like to myself, really. Like at the end of the day, like nobody's going to care. Am I really going to care in, 10 years that I did this for this place? Like I'm going to feel regret if I don't sort of, do something for myself. So.
Yeah. And I love that parallel process. Again, we were talking earlier about when we don't own our story, we're kind of a passive participant in our health, but also in our life. And so when we go through an identity change to be an advocate for our health and our body, it trickles into these other areas because we're the common denominator, right?
Right. Yeah, so I have so many other things that I could say that it's changed. I mean, it's changed my relationship with my husband. It's changed my relationship with my family in terms of I'm adopted, and I sort of had this sort of story that was sort of put upon me, and I did have counseling and like worked through that, where that was sort of a kind of another thing that was just like I was sort of passive in it, and before I had Truce with Food, and then after I was like, well, I kind of think that's a bullshit story that I've gotten fed. And yes, it's a really nice, pretty story. But there still might be some trauma from that, or, and how, and that's never occurred to anybody to sort of talk to me about that. So sort of, just owning that story, even though this is a real deep ingrained story from the moment I was born, being told sort of this happy princess story of like, you were adopted and aren't you so happy that you're with your parents now, instead of like, it's very nuanced. Yes, that's great that I had great parents, but I also was adopted. So I wasn't with a person that gave birth to me or created me. So there's something to that as well. So I sort of own that more too. So yeah.
I love that, because I think health is when we can expand our capacity for multiple truths and feelings. And yes, I'm grateful. And there's a loss and there's a trauma, and all of these things can be true. And our culture and the families that we grow up in, the communities often are in that binary, like it's either this or that. And so for us to get healthy, we often have to bring the other people along. And I think that's why it's so important when you said, I have to do this for me. If you haven't gone through the healing process, that might sound selfish to people or whatnot, but it's like, no, when we're generous, giving, kind people, and we look after ourselves, especially as women who have been told, put everyone else, before yourself, we really, give back to the community in terms of expanding the conversation and changing the narratives. And, it's a really beautiful thing. So thank you for sharing with that. I know it's very personal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, circling back, if a friend came to you and was feeling out of control around food, what would you tell them now, having gone through Truce with Food?
I think that is a kind of a hard question, because I find that, it's really challenging to have conversations that deep with people. And I feel like Truce with Food is really deep, and I think really challenging to sort of explain, of like, if it's sort of like, if you start to look at, if you start to sort of have these conversations with your boss, or you're trying to see your story, but it's really hard to explain that to them as well. But like it's not just the food, I guess, is sort of what I would sort of condense it down to, that you feel like it's probably the food, but I can tell you that the food is just really a symptom of sort of your bigger like how you sort of approach life, and not that it's a bad thing. And I'm not saying that, because you're feeling out of control of food means that you're, out of control in your life, obviously. But I feel like there's just sort of a chord through it all. And that if you can sort of start to add some more something to your life, like owning your story or sort of seeing how you interact with people, it might sort of translate into your food, and sort of that it's not really the food, and that, starting a new diet tomorrow is really not going to really fulfill that or change that.
Yes, I love that. We need more people with the courage to start that conversation.
I know, it is challenging.
Next story.
It is challenging, and because we live in such a culture of like sort of the black and white, like and we're taught that from such a young age, and I still hear it all the time, and it always makes me cringe. It's like these like really, it's sort of like a macho thing. It's like like you wake up, you make you're sort of like in the middle, like if I just follow like this militant sort of structure, if I hear these people like, number one that will change your life if you wake up and make your bed, and you're like,
that's all it takes.
Right, that's all it takes, that's it, you're never, and so this sort of militant, like everybody, it feels like I hear is like, oh, I want to, like, tomorrow just change everything, or like if I do this, everything will be better. But it's so deeper than that, and it's so much more. So
yes, that's so funny. So everyone can try to make their bed, but don't be upset if it doesn't work. Right.
Because I don't know. I've just heard so many things like that, and I'm like, I mean, I probably tried that, like making my bed, and like, oh, does that make a huge difference? Or like, if you look at a cluttered room, like you're going to eat more. And it's just like, well, when my house is clean too, I eat. So like, I don't really understand like the connection. For some people, maybe that works, but it didn't seem to make a huge difference to me. So
yeah. And what's interesting, when I say you can't fail at Truce with Food, how would you explain that to people in this? Because they think of probably failure as like, oh, you're guaranteeing results of like for everybody, but that's not what I'm saying. So how would you explain that to people? What I mean by that?
Yeah. So I always sort of thought of like after Truce With Food is sort of everything was data. So like, and that's sort of been drilled into my head by Allie. that like if you quote like a previous, what I would have considered maybe a previous failure is like a binge or something, and that really was more of like after sort of going through the process is like, okay, well, what's actually happening? Because it's not really the failure of you're okay, so you feel bad because you've eaten all this food, and so that's in your head, like you're like, oh, I'm a failure, but really it's like, well, this is just data. This is just more of me trying to understand myself, of me trying to understand what kind of triggers that, or what is out of alignment, what happened today, or what's going on in my life right now that's sort of making me make these choices, and so sort of everything kind of turned into data, like that's and sometimes it was like, I just remember feeling like at the beginning especially, like, well, I'm not gonna mess up, I'm not, because that was sort of my mantra of like, well, I'm going to be perfect, because that's sort of how I'd been kind of operating. And so like, as soon as like you mess up inevitably, it's sort of more like, okay, well, what's happening, and B, like, what's the long term of how that's actually making me feel, like instead of just feeling, self-hatred, or just like everything's ruined. So I would just say sort of you can't really fail because you're just learning more and more about yourself. So
yeah, I'm so glad that you described that so well. And when you first signed up with Truce With Food, given that you had been a sampler of other things, try for a couple of days, were you worried about getting lost or not finishing the program? Mm-hmm. And what ended up working, because you clearly finished and you're still using the tools and progressing in terms of more life freedom. So
right. I would say, I mean, it's sort of back to that sort of subtle difference of like, I was worried that I wouldn't finish it. I mean, that was sort of like, I was really worried that it's not just like it wasn't something that I just took lightly to do. and so I was really nervous. Like I put a lot of pressure on myself, you know, to finish, like that I wasn't going to finish it. I was super worried. I tried to set expectations to my husband, like, well, I'm going to try this. I really want it to work, but like it might not. But I have to, like, I felt like I just had to do it because I really felt like I didn't have any other options. So
that's what everyone says. I love that you said that.
right.
I'm your last resort for some people, not everyone.
Right. So I felt like, oh, this has to work. And when that feels that way, like there's a lot of pressure, which also can be triggering too, in a way where it's like, well, you know, like at the beginning, I felt like I was it just made things worse at the beginning for me because I had put so much pressure on myself. But then it's sort of this subtle of like, okay, like there's a lot of resources, you know, like you reached out a lot. The classroom was there always. I tend to be a bit of an avoider. So I tend to just sort of leave things. But there's sort of this, I really felt like this was one of my, like, I really felt like this was what needed to happen. And so I think that that's kind of what carried me through. And there were times too where I was like, I don't think I did this right. So, but as you can see, like I'm almost a year and a half out and so many things have changed. So like sometimes I get down on myself where I'm like, oh, I didn't learn anything. And then other times I'm like when I actually think about it, I'm like, oh yeah, I did learn a lot. So it's sort of this subtle, like, it's not going to be like just this sort of 180. It's sort of like a slow 180.
Yeah.
Right? So,
well,
yeah.
and also I think it's important because prior to Truce with Food, when you would have those thoughts of like, I haven't learned anything or I failed or whatever, we didn't know how to get out of those, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now you can zoom out and actually say, I may be feeling this way, but feelings are, you know, like the weather, they come and go. Mm-hmm. And it's actually being able to have real data to back up to say, wow, when I actually look how far I've come. Mm-hmm. But when you're still binging and you're still eating, it's hard to really trust any progress or anything, versus if you're still overeating after Truce With Food and all this stuff, like you can actually look back at, well, okay, I used to, you know, fall off track for 6 months and now it's a day, you know, and I know that I have the tools to figure out what happened so that I can prevent this from happening before. But we do need real data, I think, to show ourselves how far we've come, not just magical thinking and all that. So I'm glad you shared like the honesty there, because I don't want people thinking that they're going to, you know, walk through like the makeovers in the door if they own their story and the confetti comes down.
Yes, that's really what I wanted. I mean, that's what we all want, right? We all want that.
I want it. I would take it if I could.
Right. That's why there's so many of those makeover shows that are so popular. And I love watching them because it's like, oh, I'm just walking. But I felt like I was sort of at the end of that rope in terms of like, I couldn't do another one of those really. And so I was just like, and like at some point I kind of was like, I what do I hate more, being, you know, 15, 20 pounds overweight, or like being insane around food and having this sort of obsession. And like, I definitely felt like this obsession with food, this crazy feeling, was way more important to me than sort of at some point, because they were pretty close, neck and neck often, right? But like I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I'm sick of sort of having, you know, like every vacation I took, every holiday, everywhere, you know, any time I like met up with people I hadn't seen in a while, there's always this sort of like, oh, like I gotta diet. Like there's just this like cloud residue over it. And I was just so sick of that. I was just like, I can't live my life like this. But that's so deeply ingrained, because there's that other part of me that was like, well, I need to lose 15 pounds, but but so I kind of had to give that up a little bit about the losing the 15 pounds, because I was so crazy around food. And so that really helped. The Truce With Food helps with that crazy part for sure.
Good. Yeah. And how beneficial do you think it was to have such a small, intimate group so that you did finish and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I enjoyed hearing other people sort of going through the same thing as I did. And it was small enough that I recognized their voices and their names and their stories too. So it's sort of, that definitely did help. And sort of getting a mix, I think, of people where I was probably on the more like quieter side in it, and there were other people that were more outgoing in it, but there were other people like me who were quieter, and I felt like you gave us time for us quiet people. So I did appreciate that, and it was great to sort of not be in it alone, and that was great. That's always good. So
Yeah. So finally, what do you now know to be true about food, your body, and health? And life, maybe, since you shared so much.
Yeah. What I know to be true is that things aren't black and white. And that has been like one of the biggest life lessons, I think, that I've taken away, that, as just with all of this, that it's not, 100%, you're never going to be 100% perfect, and you're never going to be 100% bad either. So everything's so nuanced. And I think that, we just love that black and white thinking. I see it all the time with everything, and people want direct 100% answers. And I just don't think that is true. So what I know to be true is that it doesn't exist. So, everything's nuanced, super nuanced.
Well, and I love that you said that, because that's actually a developmental milestone in the way that we make meaning. Is, for a while, we do trust experts, and we put people on pedestals, and we think that they have the answers, or things are black and white, but then we hit a ceiling with that. And eventually we have to accept that the people we admire are quote unquote imperfect. They don't have all the answers, and that we have to start to create our own. And kind of how you said when we kicked off about like, wait, I have to own this, right? And then I have to bring the knowledge and all that stuff with me, versus relying on the shoulds and the have-tos. And so it's a developmental milestone for us. It's not necessarily the funnest thing, but but it is freeing, right? Like, that's the price of liberation is okay, it isn't always black and white. And I have to be able to stand in that nuance and complexity. So glad to have another healthy rebel, bringing context to things.
Yeah. Oh, context is huge. Yeah. But we don't get that often. So now, I mean, it's just, like I said, I feel like it's pervasive throughout our culture, where it's always black and white, like if you wake up tomorrow, you're going to be a different person, and you're going to start new, and it's going to be this and this and this, and you're not going to make a mistake, because when you do, then everything's out the window. And that's sort of kind of what I've learned with my health, and with with food, is that it's just so down the middle. There's so many things, and you have to just sort of pay attention. And that's kind of the fun part, is because you're sort of just learning so many other things, and learning more and more about yourself. So yeah.
Well, and that's one of the things that I love about you owning your story, and is because you went from, we talked about this, of like, when you're binging and overeating, as I experience, it's so hard to focus on your health, right? You're just like, I'm just trying to like get through the day without binging. And then when you can remove that, you can all of a sudden, I just see such a value of health born in you, or I should say grown, because it was probably there. Most people who come in Truce With Food value their health on some level. Otherwise they would be doing other things. But really take that and run with it. And I'm so happy with where you are in terms of navigating your body, especially at your age, because you've got, probably 60, 70 years ahead of you. So can make better choices.
I hope so. Yeah.
Fingers crossed, right?
Fingers crossed. Yes. So that's definitely, I mean, I just look back and I'm like, I can't believe how black and white I was about so many things. And so, it just opened up so many more possibilities. So it's been great. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Krista.
Thank you.
When you understand the root cause of what causes you to battle food, and you have someone support you to rewrite your story, so much food and life freedom and possibility are waiting for you. As you can see from my clients' stories, yes, you stop fighting food. And that is hugely relieving. And you also get back time, energy, and self-trust that would allow you to live a life aligned with your radical truth. Maybe that's a better job making more money, or it's parenting in your own style, or it's having deeper, more fulfilling relationships, or it's getting your period back so you can have children and having your skin clear up. I wonder, what would you choose to write into your story if you knew that you could?